Welcome to this Douglas Dialogues conversation, everyone. And I am so happy to be here today with Professor Jack Kaufman-McKivigan from Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, and Professor Ezra Greenspan from Southern Methodist University. And we're going to talk about his research and his forthcoming book called The Bailey Family. And our conversation today is called Frederick Douglass's Bailey Relatives of Maryland. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And Jack and Ezra, thank you for being here with us today. Thank you for joining us for Douglass Week again. And we very much look forward to the event with you today. Jack, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Carolyn. Again, my name is Jack Kaufman-McKivigan, and I am the editor of the Frederick Douglass Papers, which is my only full-time job in more than 40 years. I started working in 1979 for John W. Blassingame, who started this research project at Yale University. The goal of the Douglass Papers was to locate, collect, edit, and publish all of the, well, originally was all, turned out to be eventually a selective edition of Douglass's speeches, correspondence, autobiographies, and other published writings. John Blassingame turned over the project to me in 1994, and I have moved it twice since, first to West Virginia University and then here to Indianapolis. We're in the midst of a name change, so I'm getting the branding confused. We're now Indiana University Indianapolis. We're IUI instead of IUPUI, which we've been known for 50 years. We've also recently shifted our goal from a 15-volume selected edition, 13 now in print with Yale University Press, to a comprehensive edition of Douglass's work using the World Wide Web to produce all of Douglass's documents on a free public access website. So I encourage you, Caroline's going to give you the web address at the end of this event. So I hope you can come and visit us. That's a work in progress. It's going to take another decade to get all these Douglass documents up there. But while we were in the midst of doing this, we started to get scholars coming to us. They couldn't wait to get all these documents available to them. And the one I've enjoyed the most is a regular visitor of the Douglass Papers is the guest I have here today with you, Ezra Greenspan, who recently retired from Southern Methodist University. Let me give you a little background on Ezra. Let me see if I get this all right. You received your PhD in American Studies from Brown University, and then taught at the University of South Carolina for a considerable amount of time before you went to Southern Methodist University. Your scholarly career has three principal interests: the literary and cultural histories of the United States, especially of ethnic and racial minorities. You have a strong interest in book history, and now are indulging your interest in biography in a very expansive way, I think, with your most recent study. You started out studying Walt Whitman, which led you soon to become interested in media history. You are a founder of the interdisciplinary journal Book History and co-edited it for about 15 years. That's a big accomplishment. You wrote a very well-received biography of William Wells Brown, which I hope people all know as the first, I think it's still a sound claim, the first African-American novelist. There's always been this argument about firsts. I know of him because he was I guess, a frenemy of Frederick Douglass. Their relationship evolved, went back and forth over the years. But where I really got to know you was when you started visiting the Douglass Papers here at Indianapolis on your project to study Douglass's extended family. Remember, it's Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey originally, and his Bailey relatives back in Maryland. No, our audience, I'm sure, is very well aware of Frederick Douglass, but their knowledge of the Baileys is probably based on uh, Douglass's own autobiographies, which they are occasionally mentioned, not as much as you might expect. Some of his biographers have given us some details about that, but there was definitely a large hole in historical literature, which you have set out to fill. Uh, Now, maybe the best study you can correct me. I think of this early period of Douglass's life, or one of the best, was by a Maryland journalist named Dixon Preston, who wrote a book called Young Frederick Douglass. I guess that's now 30 years on since it was published. And he began to note for historians that Douglass's treatment, our Frederick Douglass's treatment, was different than that of many other, maybe most other Maryland slaves. Your interest in Douglass's extended family would give you a real basis to make a response to that. It was Dixon Preston accurate about that?
All credit to Dixon Preston. His book came out in 1980. Let's just say a few words about Preston, because I think he is one of the two or three most important biographers of Frederick Douglass. Preston was a newspaperman, as you mentioned, originally from Indiana, had a career with the Washington Post, a top flight journalist, and then retired, I guess around 1970, to the Eastern Shore of Maryland, had a home in Easton, and he had skills that sometimes we academics wish we had as a professional researcher. He went through the archives meticulously and, in effect, laid out the, shall we say, the roadmap for the history as we know it, as we have it, of the Bailey family. So Preston is a crucial starting point. And what Preston wanted to do was to ground Douglass. He was always interested in Douglass, as 99% of Douglass scholars are. This is not a complaint, but it's a point that needs to be taken seriously. In the state of Maryland and in the colony of Maryland. And what he found was that one could trace the Bailey family back 5 generations to a man who simply in an estate inventory in 1746 was listed as Baly. And best guess would be it was pronounced 2 syllables, Bailey. And that Bailey was the great-great-grandfather of the future Frederick Douglass. That gives us a considerable lifespan of a family and a lifespan of a nation to be. And then he traced Douglass forward really through his 2 decades in the state of Maryland. Well, what I would like to try, what I'm trying to do, is to do justice to Douglass as Preston did, as a native Marylander with a history in the state of Maryland, and to recognize him as most biographers do. Otherwise, they wouldn't write single figure biographies of Douglass, as a kind of transcendent figure, a person of, what the 19th century would call genius, and what his contemporaries, mostly white contemporaries, called the representative figure of his people. That term representative is crucial. In a way, it's the same term that Ralph Waldo Emerson, in scanning the horizon for the great, it was always men, by the way, the great men of his time, would call them representative men. This is a little bit of a digression for a second, because I've just researched this. When Emerson was preparing his first anti-slavery oration, this was in Concord, in honor of the August 1st Emancipation Day celebration. His friends had been working on him for weeks and months, including the Thoreaus and the Alcotts and the main anti-slavery people in town, to stand up and say something against slavery. Well, Douglass was there, was on the podium that day. But more interestingly than that, we know from his preparatory notes that Emerson had Douglass in mind, also Toussaint Louverture, in talking about a representative figure of, let's just call them the African American people. So that's one version of how biographers approach Douglass, and it's the main road. Where I come from, that's the I-95 corridor, heavily populated, and has been paved for a very long time. I want my cake and I want to eat it too. I certainly am foregrounding Douglass. I am making Douglass the central figure of my book. But at the same time, I want to talk about Douglass and his relationship with, shall we call them, representative African Americans who were not singularly brilliant, who were not able to master literacy by hook or by crook or by any other means, but rather to highlight Douglass's roots and his continuing service over a long, highly useful lifetime as a figure serving his people. And so that means that one wants to unearth a broader circumference around Douglass. That means going back further in time, even further than Preston did. It means bringing in a whole new cast of characters. If you think of staging a biography as something like staging a play with set scenes and characters. And it turns out Douglass, to my mind, is even more interesting because the range of his contacts and connections and the range of issues that he dealt with and the connections between his initiatives and, my key term besides family, is people, the people. Whether the people in his mind were his fellow African Americans, they were. But Douglass also, of course, is the great visionary of America as a cosmopolitan, a composite nation. Yeah. In other words, all ethnicities, and not only white and black.
Well, so you are looking at Douglass in the context of his extended Maryland family. Now, tell me if I'm wrong. I know his contemporaries used to claim that Maryland was kind of a state where slaves were not so badly treated, and Douglass often tried to tell his listeners, no, that's not true. But historians have persisted in that. In your studies of Douglass's extended family, what kind of conclusions are you reaching about slavery in the Upper South?
Right. It was the myth of his own time. Douglass talks about it repeatedly in his orations and in his published memoirs that Maryland was not a place where slavery was more humane than it was in the Deep South. The question of slavery in Douglass, I think, is again more interesting than it's typically treated in single-figure biographies of Douglass, because the Bailey family was subjected to every version of slavery or the slave experience that there was in the United States during the first 60 years. Well, let's just say for the century leading up to the Civil War. Yeah. Douglass had relatives, immediate relatives, siblings, as well as dear cousins, sold to the states of Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas. And they were part of, I'll be sarcastic about this, the great reverse exodus of slaves sold into the markets through the most brutal forms of the domestic slave trade. Douglass, growing up in Baltimore, one block from the pier from which the most notorious slave trader of the 1820s and 30s, Austin Woolfolk, was sending his slaves down. Douglass heard the chains, heard the moans of people. It was always late at night because it was understood to be something that should not be exposed to the general public. So Douglass's family suffered in that fashion. Douglass was keenly aware of them. He was subjected to the breakup of families. The Baileys were divided because of deaths and complicated happenings within the family of the Masters, the Anthonys, on 5 separate occasions. And Douglass stood on the auction block alongside his relatives. So he knew about that. Douglass, of course, ran away. Douglass was not the only Bailey who ran away. His aunt and uncle had run away 10 years earlier. 2 weeks after they took off, their 2 children were sold down through Austin Woolfolk down to the Deep South. And that was undoubtedly cause and effect. I mean, we don't know why Douglass's aunt and uncle, whom he knew, he'd grown up with them. They were only a few years older than he. We don't know why they took off. It's almost unimaginable in a family as tightly knit as the Baileys. They were a remarkable family. They were tightly knit. They were coherent. They had been for generations. Why would a young mother and father abandon their children? These kinds of questions are just critical, and they relate directly to Douglass because Douglass was there. He was on the farm when this happened. And 6 months after Douglass escaped from Baltimore, famously, and we almost treat it as singular in the family, his cousin Phil did exactly the same thing. He escaped from the Easton area. Like Douglass, there was a woman involved. Her name is not known, but they took off together.
Oh.
And unlike Douglass, they've not been located. And then finally, that other version of Maryland slavery, after all, by the Civil War, about half of the African Americans in Maryland who had been enslaved had been freed. The numbers are basically identical between the number of Black slaves and the number of Black free people at the time of the Civil War. Many of those manumitted people were freed after the American Revolution. They include the parents of his future wife, Anna Murray. In fact, Anna Murray's parents were freed from very, very large farms, almost a throwaway from Home Hill on the western shore of the Tuckahoe. They were on the eastern shore in Caroline County, and their family history, which after all becomes part of the Douglass family history, has yet another trajectory. And so, the question of slavery and Douglass, like the broader framework that I'm trying to develop, is actually a very rich one with many variations. Douglass is exceptional in one sense, but when you think of him in terms of the larger story of his family is unexceptional. They're utterly, to use that earlier term, they're utterly representative.
Oh. Lot to digest there. I always tell my students that slavery was a very personal relationship, depending on the personality of that enslaved individual and of the enslaver. Uh, Now you referred to how the Bailey family was, many of them were the possessions of the Anthony family. So this is the White family. When Aaron Anthony died, the slaves are distributed, and so the Baileys were scattered among these individuals. And how did, almost like a winning and losing a lottery, depending on who you got to be sent away to, how did that affect the different branches of Douglas's relatives?
I can give you a simple answer to that question: profoundly. It made a tremendous difference. And just to augment the question, uh, the Baileys had been separated earlier from their previous owners, a family named Skinner. Anthony, who is a poor boy from Tuckahoe, Caroline County, but a boy of ambition and talent, uh, and utterly unscrupulous, married a Skinner, married way above his head into one of the first families of Talbot County. The Skinners had owned Bailey's, but here it's murky. It looks to me as though Bailey's had been separated, probably living on nearly adjacent farms during the last third of the 18th century before Anthony marries a Skinner. I think it's 1797, 1798, and owns the family. Really, the key figure in the family is Betsy. Betsy Bailey, who is the granddaughter of the original Bailey. She's the median point between the beginning of the Baileys as we know them in the New World and Frederick. She was Frederick's grandmother. And Betsy Bailey was a matriarch. She was a powerful figure. And I can imagine her standing toe to toe with Master Anthony. She knew how to be careful, but she also knew how to protect her children to a limited extent. Anthony dies. Betsy is very much alive and will be alive for another 20 years. And the children are, rather, the Baileys are broken up, separated, or the term that was used was divided. So you can divide human beings. They were divided into three portions, each third going to one of the Anthony children. And the story of the Baileys during that, what I think of as an interregnum, from about 1828 until about 1850, is that the three children all die either in their mid-20s, their late 20s, or the last, Andrew Skinner Anthony, he dies in his early 30s, probably of alcoholism. Each time one of them dies, their property gets redivided. By the second time, the third time, it's redivided. The great luck, to come to your question directly now, of Frederick Bailey Douglass is that he went, shall we say, to the most benevolent or the least malevolent of the children. And it certainly seems clear that this daughter, Lucretia, and her husband, Thomas Auld, had some regard for this boy. Everyone saw that Frederick was different, or rather that Frederick had qualities. And it does seem that Lucretia had a special fondness for this bright boy who I think she felt needed to be protected.
After all, he's probably her half brother.
This is the great question. We do not know. We still do not know who the father was. But certainly, if rumors had reached Frederick, they would have reached Lucretia, the daughter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, yeah. You almost like to think there was a curse on the Anthony family, a well-deserved curse of that generation being Aaron Anthony's children all being short-lived. Well, But let's keep our focus on the Baileys. Now, Douglass, as you noted, made a successful escape from Baltimore in 1838 and moves to Massachusetts and eventually goes on to settle in Rochester, New York, up until through the Civil War. Now, during this period, did Douglass have any contact or gain any information about the extended family he left behind enslaved in Maryland?
Right. And this is where I put out an all points inquiry to anybody on the planet Earth who has information. This is a great question.
I'd
And,
like that
you know,
information too.
yeah, and I think it's an absolutely critical question for understanding the inner the inner world of Frederick Douglass. And just to heighten or intensify the inquiry a little bit, I believe that Douglass was in his heart of hearts always a Marylander. No matter where he lived, however far he traveled, his heart and his sensibility tracked back to Maryland. And we know that at the end of his life. I mean, he lives, after all, many years in Anacostia overlooking Washington, D.C., and would have spent his summers on the Chesapeake, where his son was building him a retirement home. Douglass loved Maryland. He hated it, and he loved it in a way that he felt ambivalently about his entire past. There is an amazing moment when Douglass had first become a professional lecturer for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society in 1841, just a couple of months after he'd gone to work for them, which is to say for the Garrisonians. He went to an all-day meeting in the vicinity of Boston. In fact, part of the speech that he gave is in volume 1 of the Yale edition of the Speeches and Orations. Folks can check this. And Douglass was just one of about a half dozen speakers. But something special happened in the course of that day. Meetings went during the afternoon. They then broke for a communal supper and reassembled in the evening. These folks could really talk. They went on for hours and hours.
Very true.
And one of the resolutions that came up in the afternoon session was whether the Anti-Slavery Society should help pay for the freedom of the children of a fugitive slave then living in Boston named Lunsford Lane. Lane was a very eloquent, well-spoken fugitive from slavery, I believe in Raleigh, somewhere in North Carolina, had left his wife and about 6 children behind. And this was an impossible question for the Garrisonians. How do you not consent, but how do you consent? Pay ransom money. And the convention split. Most of the lecturers for Garrison said, no, we're not going to do it. But Douglass argued, yes, we ought to do it. In fact, I have 4 brothers and 1 sister who remain behind in slavery. This is interesting.
Yeah.
Because Douglass had 4 sisters and 1 brother that remained behind in slavery. Now, the source for this is a local newspaper. And the reporter, who was enthralled by Douglass, he highlighted Douglass, wrote it in that fashion. They reconvened in the evening. And again, the subject came up, but amazingly, Lunsford Lane shows up for the evening session. No one expected him. And I won't tell you what happens in the end. Let's stick to Douglass. But apparently Douglass again raised the subject of his own family. And The newspaper account in the local newspaper was so long that the editor, it was a weekly newspaper, had to print it in two parts. And in the first part, he prints four brothers and one sister. In the second, shall we say, the revised count, he gets it right, four sisters and one brother. And there's even an asterisk at the bottom of the printed page pointing out that there had been a mistake made. Newspapers very, very rarely did this.
Yeah.
So what must have happened? Douglass saw the newspaper and realized this is just not right. I want the truth such as it is. I'm not going to tell my name. I'm not going to tell where I came from, but the facts have to be right when it comes to my family. It's a long way of saying, here's a documentary moment where we know Douglass had his brothers and sisters in mind probably all the time.
Yeah.
How much did he know about what was going on? Well, I would guess that he had a broad understanding of what had been happening. Why? Because slaves were escaping on the Underground Railroad. That was the I-95 of the Underground Railroad during that period. Many of them came from Maryland. After all, his future, as it were, his sister Harriet,
Yeah.
whose real name was Ruth Cox, and whom he adopted, brought into his family, who became, in effect, Harriet's helpmate. Ruth had come directly from the area in which Douglass had grown up. She knew everything. And there must have been other people as well. Also, after 1848, let's remember Douglass was the best connected African American journalist of the 19th century. And if you look carefully at the newspapers, there are many accounts of slavery in Maryland.
Yeah.
So I think, it's only speculation, but I think deep down, he couldn't get these people out of his mind. And practically speaking, he must have been making inquiries.
Yeah, I'm really curious. Are there any clues that the Baileys, the enslaved Baileys, had heard about Douglass's career as an abolitionist before the Civil War?
Right. Now, that's the other half of the proposition. The only documentary evidence that I know of is that Eliza Bailey Mitchell, his beloved sister, probably emotionally the sibling he was almost certainly that he was closest to growing up, was waiting outside that church in Baltimore in November of 1864. It is really one of the most beautiful moments in my mind in all of Douglass's life, where it had been widely reported that Douglass was coming to Baltimore. He had been away since 1838. Slavery had just ended 2 weeks earlier in Baltimore. Douglass couldn't wait to come back.
Yeah.
And Eliza was there. Eliza was not literate. How did she know? Well, people were talking. So certainly by the time of the Civil War, I think it's fair to guess that his family knew about him. It's quite possible that they would have heard things even by the 1850s. There were papers in Baltimore, especially, that were keeping an eye on this Frederick Douglass. After 45, they knew who he was. So it's all speculation,
Yeah.
but I think that the family ties were somehow intact.
Yeah. Well, before we jump to the Civil War, there's this one person you mentioned that I want to talk a little more about. That's Betsy Bailey. There's been this issue that historians have thrown around that Douglass talks in his first two autobiographies about the mistreatment of Betsy Bailey by Thomas Auld in her declining years. And more recently, we're starting to realize that perhaps, well, Thomas Auld claimed that wasn't the case, How was, have you found out how Betsy was treated, and why did Douglas not get this accurately? Of course, we can understand because of the distance, but even when he does know, he seems to repeat this in Life and Times, pretty harsh accounting of Thomas All's behavior toward Betsy Bailey.
Right. Another great question. And again, how one answers a question so deep and rich is itself a proposition. And let me start from the outside in. As Betsy Bailey aged, remember, this woman lives an extraordinarily long life, as long as Frederick, and without Frederick's advantages.
Yeah.
She lives into her 70s. You know, to use the term of the period, she was superannuated. This was a common, I'm going to use the term sarcastically, it was a common problem that slave owners had in places like Talbot County, what to do with a slave when the slave was no longer useful. Men were one kind of a problem, women were perhaps a different kind of a problem. I think of it as a category. This is part of how one can unearth, when you don't have the documentary facts, you put them into context and look what else is going on in the neighborhood. And I found an almost identical case in St. Michael's, which is where Betsy would have died, of a woman probably in her 70s named Cressy. Betsy knew Cressy, Cressy knew Betsy, with exactly the same problem. This is in the court records because nobody wanted to take care of her. Somebody had to put up money to keep this poor woman who had served the family for decades, keep her alive. I think the story of Betsy is slightly more humane than that. Douglass, in writing first in 1845, that's pretty close to where the wound was, I think wrote with a certain amount of survivor's guilt that he got away. His life had taken the course that it had. His mother was dead. His mother he barely knew. So Betsy was both his mother and his grandmother. You know, I think of Betsy in my biblical terminology. She's mother, grandmother Rachel, mourning for her children, orphans, all lost. And I think that deep down, Douglass mourned that loss. And so he was somewhat predisposed to come out tough on what he'd heard, rumors about his grandmother. And that too is a documentary source, that Douglass had heard that his grandmother was being mistreated. This was after he had escaped in 1838. But in fact, all did take Betsy out of her home on Tuckahoe, on Home Hill Farm, all the way on the other side of the county, and brought her to live with him in St. Michael's on the Chesapeake side. Not in the house. Black people didn't live in the master's house, but rather presumably in the kitchen. If so, that would be the same kitchen that Douglass had lived in as an adolescent before he was rented out for those 2 years of misery. And presumably there were, I'm trying to remember the exact years, there might still have been a few Baileys living in that kitchen at the time. Auld would free all of his slaves before the Civil War. And so I think Betsy, not to understate the incredible misery and pain and also pride of her life, but I think that Douglass got it wrong. And he does retract in the second version, or later yet, perhaps, I don't remember when, but he does recant and say, I misspoke. And I think that is a sign of Douglass's magnanimity.
Yeah.
He was a truth teller, and when he made a mistake, he was able to admit it.
Okay. Interesting. Oh, that's very, it's an interesting. I had a strong relation to my own grandmother, so Betsy Bailey's always been somebody who's fascinated me. So, well, I promised people, our listeners, that we talk about the Civil War, and remember, Maryland was a slave state that did not secede, and therefore emancipation came to Maryland in a different way than it did to the Deep South, and so therefore it came in a different way to those Baileys than a majority of other enslaved Americans. Could you describe the wartime experiences of Maryland's Baileys?
Yeah, this is a great question. Again, Maryland was different. Maryland was northern and Maryland was southern. And the two shores, east and west, were north and south. The northern part, the western part of Maryland, leaned to the Union. The southern and the eastern shore leaned to the Confederacy. The state was the center ground of the Union during the Civil War. Without Maryland, there was going to be no Union victory. And Maryland was split down the middle, not just territorially, but ideologically. And so it was crucial to Lincoln. And I think it's a sign of Lincoln's political mastery that he really had to balance his policies with extraordinary delicacy. And so Lincoln waits. In fact, emancipation comes to Maryland on November the 1st, 1864, comes to most of the rest of the country on January 1st, 1863. Maryland was a particular problem for Lincoln because already by the summer of 63, around the time of Gettysburg, African-American slaves began to abandon, at great risk, their farms and plantations. They were going to Washington, they were going to Baltimore, they were going north. They were getting out of Dodge, as we say. And at that time, Lincoln was committed to enlisting African Americans, first free African Americans, into the Union Army and Navy, and then gradually over the course from August until December of 63, slaves as well. And it is an amazing campaign that takes place. We're coming to the Baileys in a second, because they're going to get onto this freedom train toward the end of the period. They begin very gradually and very carefully to recruit slaves directly off of farms, plantations, villages, towns, and cities, directly into the Union Army. In effect, slave masters were selling for a $300 bounty their slaves to the Army, perhaps rather than to lose, kind of a gamble. Am I going to risk everything? Am I going to risk, I'll take what I can get, or it's going to happen anyway. They're going to take my slaves away from me. Let me get something while I can. Six Maryland Black units were formed to the United States Colored Troops, the USCT, between August and December of 63. At the very end of that period, Douglass's favorite cousin, his closest cousin, Stephen Bailey, who is 1 year younger than Fred, and although we have no documentary evidence about their relationship until much, much later, Douglass would visit cousin Stephen in the Tuckahoe area in the 1880s and 1890s. But Stephen Bailey and his branch of the family had gone in the division of the family had gone to the son Andrew Anthony, Aaron Anthony's son. Andrew died very young, and his son John Anthony inherited that core group of the Baileys and moved them out to Home Hill Farm. So in effect, by 1850, the Baileys are back on Home Hill Farm, where in effect they had originated 50, 60 years before. And they remained on Home Hill Farm right into the Civil War. Stephen and his oldest son, George Washington Bailey, were sold by John Anthony directly to the Union Army, and they become soldiers with the 9th and the 19th USCT, and they fight in major battles, mainly in the Virginia campaign, right up to the end of the war. In fact, with 99% likelihood, I think we can make the claim that on the day that Richmond fell, on April the 4th, 1865, Stephen Bailey, the father, and George Washington Bailey, the son, met in Richmond. Their regiments, it's a complicated story to simplify it. The regiments, in effect, were among the first Black regiments to go into Richmond, and I'm presuming that father and son immediately sought each other out and were there, in effect, when the Confederacy died. So we have, in addition to the stories, and the heroism of the Douglass sons, the cousins up north, who have a somewhat different trajectory with Massachusetts regiments, we have an equally glorious and remarkable story of the heroism of a man, after all, Douglass's age, and his oldest son in fighting for the Union. And then after that, they're sent off with many of the Black regiments. When white regiments were sent home after the war, many of the Black regiments were sent the ultimate booby prize. One can hardly begin to describe how awful it was to be posted along the Rio Grande in 1865, 1866, supposedly guarding the international border against Mexicans, Native Americans. There were no Native Americans there, and rebels. But what they were fighting actually was disease. But in any case, there is the story of how Maryland regiments, of whom the Baileys were pretty typical and exemplary figures, how their Civil War played out. And that, to me, is a crucial part of the larger story that, in effect, has never been told. Douglass covered the Civil War as a journalist. He recruited for the Union Army, but in fact, the story is quite a bit broader, more comprehensive. And I'll just give you one other little tidbit. On that day, April the 4th, 1865, when the Bailey father and son, in effect, march into Richmond, Douglass just happened to be in Boston when word of the fall of Richmond circulated. That was on April the 3rd. Boston held an enormous celebration at Faneuil Hall on the 4th. Speaker after speaker comes forward. Only one makes the point that it was African-American troops. Douglass says it almost poetically. It's that typical, almost biblical parallel style that he likes to use as the retreating steps of the Confederate soldiers went out, the incoming steps of the Black soldiers entered the city, but Douglass didn't know that his own cousins were among those Black troops.
Yeah. You made an allusion to Douglass's own sons in the Union Army. Didn't they, at the end of their service, make contact with their Maryland relatives even before Frederick did?
Yes. It was a very important moment for Lewis. Uh, if I were thinking of how one tells the life story of Lewis, uh, the remarkable Lewis Henry Douglass, uh, he was incapacitated. He very nearly died of his wounds and their complications following the assault in South Carolina. Uh, he was struggling to get his feet on the ground, on top of his problems of health and his problematic relationship with the wonderful woman he loved, but who wasn't quite ready to marry him at that time. Uh, he had the idea of going down to his father's home territory and his mother's home territory, to the Eastern Shore, and starting a school for educating Black children, the free children. And that school was, ironically, just about a mile from where the story does get a little complicated. But after the end of slavery, the Anthonys sold Home Hill Farm. I don't think it was a going proposition without the labor of the Baileys. And they moved down below St. Michael's on the Eastern Shore. And right virtually in that neighborhood, Lewis decided that he was going to start a school for children. And while there, at the very beginning, as he was trying to do this, he walked up, pretty much the route that his father would have walked, or run from Covey's farm to the supposed sanctuary of Thomas Auld's home. That was no sanctuary, as it turns out. And on the road to St. Michael's, where Eliza and most of the family then were, he meets a couple of people whom he later understands were relatives. It's a little bit like the scenes in Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison, where everybody in that rural county that Milkman is going back to is a member of his family. Well, that's the way families were.
Yeah.
There must have been dozens and dozens of Baileys across Talbot County by that point. And then he goes back to his father's homeland, as it were. The meeting with Eliza, is deeply meaningful to both of them. And not just the Black relatives come to see the child of Frederick, but even some of the white patrician figures, including Hamilton, who said, if he says to Thomas Auld, if you let that slave of yours come near my property again, I'm going to shoot him. He probably would have, but that Hamilton comes to see the son of Frederick Douglass. That, I guess, connects to your earlier question. People knew, and it is another heartwarming moment where one sees family feeling descending a generation. Of course, it's going to descend, to our own time, many generations.
Well, Ezra, I'm getting sensitive to the time, but you just have to tell us a little bit about the Baileys, the careers of the Baileys after emancipation. I think
Well, this is a portion of the book that I have yet to write, and writing requires more research. But a short version of the story would be this: when Stephen and his son George are finally freed from the army, from Texas, separately, because they're with different regiments, they sail back to Baltimore. They're released, and they go back to the general area of Home Hill Farm. Now, this is in very early 1867. So emancipation had come more than 2 years earlier. And what the family had been doing while there were many children, probably at least 10 children by this point, and there would be more children, even though Stephen was getting close to 50 years of age, there were going to be 2 or 3 more children born after the war, after his release. He bought a farm over in Caroline County. This is quite interesting. By and large, Talbot County landowners were not selling land to former slaves. But over in Caroline, things were looser. And what the land that Stephen bought, eventually in the family became known as the Bailey family homestead. And it was a going operation for decades. It passed to one of his older sons, George Bailey, a really remarkable man. These Baileys, Jack, were people of great ability. The apple hadn't fallen quite as far from the tree as, the typical, hagiographic leaning views of Douglass might indicate. Yeah. Stephen was a very fine man. It was a fine family. The children did well in their individual ways. George eventually married a niece of Bishop Wayman, of Alexander Wayman, who was a very, very close family friend of both Anna and Frederick. In fact, their farms, the farm that Anna must have grown up on and the farm that the Waymans owned, they were landowners, were virtually adjacent. They knew each other from childhood. In any case, George married a niece of Bishop Wayman and opened a general purpose store in the county seat of Denton. It apparently was one of the most successful stores, white or black, in Denton from around 1885 to, I think he died around 1920. George had a car, if you can imagine that, presumably a Model T. The next generation produces a college professor. These were very interesting people. Eliza's family also, I must admit, I know less about them. They're harder to track, but I would guess that one would find fairly similar kinds of stories of people who made their mark in very, very difficult circumstances.
Yes, very difficult. I'm sure some of our viewers might be curious. They might be interested in, doing research on their own roots, excuse the pun, to trace the earlier generations back. What were some of the sources that you used to find this information about all these, the extended Bailey family?
Well, lots and lots of people are doing what you're outlining. I believe, Jack, that it is peoples who suffer great historical disruptions who have a tremendous impulse to go back and find their roots. And in this country, one of the premier groups, of course, is African Americans. There are more and more people like me, professionals, trying to do it, and there are many, many, many more people doing it for their own families. I think everybody goes to Ancestry.com, goes to the related sites, the family genealogical sites. It is infinitely easier to do today than it was 20 years ago because of the massive digitization, and one can presume it'll be easier yet in 5 or 10 years. To do it the hard way, if you have military connections or think you have military connections, the National Archives. And look in particular, the single richest source that I've been able to find are the pension records.
Oh, yeah.
Many of these soldiers, vets, took out pensions, and sometimes the pension file will include dozens and dozens of documents, since it seems that the pension gatekeepers did everything they possibly could to make it difficult, what's changed, for vets to get their benefits. Also, the regimental records, those are digitized. You can find them on fold 1, fold 3, whatever it is, fold whatever. Those are digitized and broadly available. The pension records are not. I think it's a national disgrace that the U.S. has not undertaken that kind of a project. Local historical societies are invaluable resources. Go to your public library if it has a genealogical or history room, your state archives. Some states are richer than others. Maryland, as we say in Texas, bless its soul, has a particularly keen appetite for this kind of record keeping, and perhaps because it avoided the ravages of the Civil War by and large, most of the records are intact. Those are the basic places that one might go.
Yeah. I also always tell my students to talk to the grandparents, to find the oral tradition that has survived in the family. Have you run into more the currently living generation of some of the descendants of the Baileys?
A little bit. There are two different kinds of sources of that sort. One is sources that they might have recorded. In other words, African American families are remarkable in producing reunion documents. Some of them are just amazing. And there you have direct access, as it were, to members of the family talking to other members of the family, and in effect trying to triangulate all these different versions into something more composite. Finding living members of families, of course, is absolutely critical. Well, we're blessed, first of all, to have Nettie Washington Douglass as a great public figure and a repository of course, not just of the Douglass, but also of the Booker T. Washington family. Douglasses and Baileys have a remarkably keen, developed sense of who they are, who their people were, and who their people have been. And so, of course, one hopes to meet the living relatives. And the Douglass family, again, their memories are keen, and their power as a family is really extraordinary.
Well, I hope this show that maybe some of the people watching, maybe one of you is a descendant of one of Douglass's cousins or siblings, and now that Ezra would be really interested in getting in touch with you and learning what you've heard through growing up about your ancestors. It would be a great contribution to this history project that you're putting together. Ezra, I've been hearing about for a decade, and I continue to look forward to its completion and dissemination to the broad public. It's a wonderful story that you're telling. This family has to be better known in history, not just for that one exemplar Frederick, but all the Baileys made a big contribution to history. So thank you for being the guest on this show today. It's going to wrap up our conversation, and it's been a really great experience talking with you. Thank you again.
Thank you, Jack.
Yeah, and thank you also from our side here at the Douglass Week team. We've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you, Professor Jack Kaufman-McKivigan and Professor Ezra Greenspan, for sharing your very valuable insights about Frederick Douglass today. And I'm always amazed about the many details that you have been able to uncover about Douglass and his family and extended family. And it was really exciting specifically today to learn more about the Bailey family. So thank you so much for that. And we'll make sure to include important links related to the work and the research that you're doing here in the YouTube description, but also on our website, so our audiences can explore and learn more about everything that you guys are doing. So yeah, make sure that you check out the links, get in touch with Ezra and Jack if you have information for them, and also keep an eye out for Ezra's book about the Bailey family to be published hopefully very soon. We can't wait, Ezra. And thank you, guys, for joining us here today. Thank you, everyone, for watching this Douglass Dialogues conversation, and happy Douglass Week, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.